Welcome to Groups Part 2, Decision Making. Do we make decisions better in groups, or would we be better off putting ourselves in rooms and making our own decisions all by our lonesome selves? Well, that's the question for today. So take this jar of jelly beans. If you're sitting there at home right now, just take a look at that jar and think to yourself, how many jelly beans do you think are in that jar? Well, someone's done this research. Jack Trainer looked at each individual's estimate of how many jelly beans are in that jelly bean jar. And what he wanted to know was who's more accurate, individuals or the group as a whole? And so he had 56 students. Each of them guessed how many jelly beans were in that jar. And on average, if you average across all the guesses, they were all over the place. Some guessed very few, some guessed really high. They were overestimators, underestimators, etc. But on average, the average guess was that there were 871 jelly beans. And you know what? They were pretty darn close. There were actually 850 beans in the jar. So it's not only, though, that the group was pretty accurate on a whole, only one person in that entire group of 56 students actually did better than the group average. This effect is called the wisdom of the crowd, that if you get a bunch of people together and you pool their guesses, the average guess is better than any one individual's. Now, why would that be? Well, one answer is just statistical. Small samples are noisy, and each of us is an N of one very, very, very small sample. So bigger samples are more accurate. So take, for instance, though, more real-world decisions. Most of our kinds of group decision-making we think of aren't fancy things like how many jelly beans are in a jar, but complicated social decisions, like which of the suspects in a murder was most likely to have committed the crime. So take, for instance, a murder mystery. Imagine you're solving this mystery, as some of you in fact have, and you're told only one of the suspects that you're about to learn about could have committed the crime. We would like you to read over the materials carefully and decide who you think committed it. And you have 10 minutes now to decide. Well, who's going to be more accurate? Each individual person or a group of detectives working together? So this really gets at the core of the question, are we better off making decisions in groups or by ourselves? So in Stasser et al. 1992, they looked at this and what's come to be called the murder mystery study. And what they found was that, in fact, groups did better to a point. So in a three-person group, when they put three would-be detectives together in a group, they got the suspect correct about 50% of the time. But individuals on their own did much worse. What's interesting, though, is it wasn't just always that more heads equals better decisions. When they looked at a six-person group, accuracy went down again, down to 30%. So it seems like putting people in groups helped, but only if they were in small groups. Big groups actually did worse. So do groups do better than individuals? Well, sometimes, but not always. We're going to talk more about why it's not always the case. So there are good things about groups. One, we like them. We like being in them. Small groups can make better decisions sometimes than individual people left to themselves. And the wisdom of the crowd suggests that on average, if you pool all of our knowledge, we do better than any one individual would have gotten it right alone. But if you've ever been in a group project, you know that this is not always the case. So take a moment real quick, think to yourself, do you like mandatory group projects? And should we have one in this class? Yes or no? Well, I don't think I have to tell you that data from previous classes suggests that overwhelmingly 95% of people say no, we do not like mandatory group projects. And why don't we like them? Because they're bad. We're going to spend the rest of the lecture today talking about why groups sometimes can end up with such bad decisions when it seems like if you get a bunch of smart people together in a room, they should be making the best decisions, not the worst. So one conundrum is that big groups do make worse decisions. One reason for that is groups are bad for brainstorming because of process loss, but another problem that we're going to talk about in some depth is groupthink and group polarization. So imagine we had a brainstorming task. Go ahead and do this with me for a second. Grab a pen and paper. And I want you to think about how we could improve parking at the university. I'm going to give you 30 seconds, and I want you to write down as many unique ideas as you can possibly think about. So grab your pen and paper. I'm going to get you started in just a second. All right. Go. 25 seconds left. I'm sure you're coming up with some great ideas right now. 15 seconds, your time is half up. All right. Do, 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 do. Do, 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 do. 4 seconds, 3 seconds, 2, 1. Put down your pen. All right. How many ideas did you think of? How many unique ideas? You think they're pretty good? They're probably actually pretty darn decent. But imagine we had asked you to do this in a group. So Deal and Strobe looked at this, and they looked at brainstorming in an in-person group versus the same number of people individually. So for instance, a 3-person group versus those same 3 people individually, a 6-person group versus those same 6 people individually. And what they wanted to know is which group produced more non-redundant ideas. So tally up how many ideas you came up with real quick and take a look at it. And what they found in 22 studies, they did a heap ton of studies on this, was that 82% of the time, the individuals did better than the same number of people in a group. So 3 people listing ideas independently of each other did better than the 3 people trying to come up with ideas together. Brainstorming in groups is a terrible idea. We shouldn't do it. Don't do it. Avoid great brainstorming. It is not good for idea creation. But why? Why doesn't group brainstorming work? Now, there's 3 possibilities. One is that it's awkward. Like, I don't want to tell you all of my terrible ideas for improving parking at the university, like building helium balloons that airlift us in from remote parking lots, because I know you're going to tell me that's a crazy idea. Another possibility is that I am just really lazy. These are called free riders, where you literally just like hop on board the idea train and do nothing. This is social loafing. We talked about social loafing before, where people in a group don't shout as loud as people individually because they can get away with it. Why can they get away with it? Why do you see social loafing? Because nobody knows that you're doing a bad thing. If you're just sitting there and you're not being evaluated and people don't know you're not contributing, why not just take it easy and relax and enjoy the ride? And then 3, another possibility is that the problem doesn't have to do with these motivational factors, that maybe people want to contribute, but realistically, if you have a group of 3 people, you can only speak one at a time. We can't all speak simultaneously, which means that if we're trying to list ideas in 30 seconds, if I am one individual, I have 30 seconds to list all my ideas. If I'm in a 3-person group, each of us only has 10 seconds to list our ideas. If I'm in a 6-person group, we only have 5 seconds each. And that ends up meaning that instead of each of us having the whole time to come up with ideas, because the others are listening during that time, we only end up coming up with a few ideas at a time because we only have able to speak one at a time. So Deal and Strobe looked at this and they identified this last solution, blocking, as the primary reason, which I actually think is pretty cute. It's not that people are afraid to share their ideas necessarily or that they're too lazy. We literally just can't, because we can't all speak at once. So if you're going to group brainstorm, at least do it where everyone brainstorms individually first and then shares the information later. Now, groups can also do worse in other ways. So anything that makes groups do worse than individuals is often called process loss. This is any aspect of group interaction that inhibits good problem solving. For instance, failing to pay attention to the expert in the room. You can also have a failure to share unique information. If I'm in a meeting with 30 people and I know this really important little detail, but I assume everyone else knows it already, so pluralistic ignorance, or I just don't feel comfortable sharing that unique information, that means the whole group isn't going to learn it. And if everyone's doing that, that means that all of the unique information that we bring to the table, all of our unique strengths, is just totally lost. The third problem, we're going to talk about this for a second because it's a little bit wild, is groupthink. Now, groupthink is a kind of decision making where people prioritize getting along more than getting it right. So this is the opposite of the I'm not here to make friends mentality of reality shows, where they don't care what friendships they burn in a hurry because they want to win and they want to get it right. In groupthink, I'm so concerned with making sure that the group is like getting along and that I'm liked, that I kind of let making the right decision decisions fall to the wayside. And that, as you might expect, can end catastrophically. So, in groupthink, members in decision-making groups become more concerned with retaining the approval of the fellow members of their work group than with coming up with good solutions to the tasks at hand. You sometimes hear this as surrounding yourself with yes men, not to be gendered, or yes people, where everyone is more concerned with making sure the boss likes them than actually giving good solutions. So what kinds of situations lead to this? Well, there are a few characteristics of situations where you might be at risk of groupthink. So think of the groups you're involved with. Anytime where you have high group cohesion, where everyone kind of gets along and goes along with the crowd, anytime you're working in isolation, so my group is all together, we're highly cohesive and we don't talk to other groups, we're all isolated in our own little silo and we're all along for the ride. And 3, when we have a directive leader, so it's not just that we're super cohesive and we're isolated from other viewpoints, we have someone that's giving strong directions and we're highly motivated to go along with the flow, follow those directions, and we're not hearing any pushback from other folks because we've isolated ourselves. And finally, stress. If everyone's laid back and relaxed, maybe someone has the time to stop this and say like, hey, hold up. Maybe we need to think about this. But when people are stressed out, they tend to go with the easy solution. And in a place where the schema is to go along with the crowd and do the right thing and seek approval from others, stress makes it worse. Finally, the biggest problem and the one thing that could possibly stop this but doesn't is that there's no decision-making procedures in place to stop it. Now, good decision-making procedures have checkpoints. They ask you to go through checklists and double check that everything you're doing is on task. If you don't have that kind of structure, you don't have that kind of formality, and people are just wilding all over and doing whatever they want, and there's no real procedure for objecting or saying no, then guess what, folks? People go with the flow. And when the flow is to follow the leader and to stick together and not make noises and not make ripples, then if the leader is suggesting bad ideas, everyone's going to go along with that leader. This is a real thing. I'm going to show you this video for a second. If you don't want to see this, you don't have to. You can fast forward if you need to. I'm going to show you a video of the Challenger explosion in 1986. And this is a heavy video. These are people, 7 astronauts who lost their lives that day. And I'm going to show you this video because I think it's important to commemorate what happened and to remember this sacrifice. And I want us to remember these are real people in real lives and not just a fun example for us to talk about in a class. So here we go.
T-minus 21 seconds and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading down range. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%. 3 engines running normally. 3 good fuel cells. 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
So the 25th Space Shuttle mission is now on the way after more delays than NASA cares to count. This morning, it looked as though they were not going to be able to get off.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
looks like a couple of the solid rocket boosters blew away from the side of the shuttle in an explosion.
Flight controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction. We have no downlink.
We're awaiting word. They're holding their breath, just, I'm sure, as everyone else is. You saw it just a few moments ago, about 45 seconds after liftoff, a huge fireball in the sky.
We have a report from the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. Flight director confirms that. We are looking at checking with the recovery forces to see what can be done at this point. Contingency procedures are in effect. We will report more as we have information available. Again, to repeat, we have a report relayed through the flight dynamics officer that the vehicle has exploded. We are now looking at all the contingency operations and awaiting word from any recovery forces in the downrange field.
What appears to be a major catastrophe in America's space program. Challenger, only seconds after leaving the launch pad, according to NASA, has exploded in midair. No word yet on if there are any survivors.
There were not. All 7 of the astronauts that took off that day died when 76 seconds after liftoff, the shuttle exploded. There was a leak in the rocket booster fuel joint. The leak led to the explosion, which led to the loss of the entire crew, including teacher Kristen McAuliffe, who was the first civilian to join a NASA crew in space. How do you get this so wrong? Like, I look at this video and I just think about the effort and the teamwork that went into this, and it went wrong. We found out later, so all 7 crew members perished, but we found out later that there was a lot of things that went wrong that day. The shuttle was launched in abnormally cold temperatures. It was extra cold that day. You'll notice, too, in the video, they even talk about how originally they thought, oh, maybe we shouldn't launch the shuttle. And as they're talking about that, the shuttle exploded. Part of the concern about the cold and it being so cold was that the O-rings, which are, if you're not a mechanical sort of person, O-rings are these little tiny rubber rings that seal liquid cases. So if you have a little rubber O-ring in it, it keeps water from getting in. I scuba dive, and we have little rubber O-rings in our wrist computers, for instance, to keep the water out and seal the water. And those O-rings were what were sealing the fuel containers so that that fuel couldn't leak into places where it could explode. And so those O-rings, because they're made of like a rubbery kind of substance, can only get so cold before they get brittle. And they believe that this problem with the O-rings is what led the fuel to leak and ultimately to explode and cost 7 people their lives. And the question in the wake of this that people are really in some ways still asking today, over 30 years later, is that how Could such a bad decision have been made to launch the Challenger, even with these concerns being raised, given how many hundreds of people were involved? And I hope you realize by now in the talk, what we've talked about today, that having more people involved is not a safeguard against these kinds of bad decisions. That what happened there was groupthink. There wasn't a strong decision-making protocol to stop the launch. There was already a sense of isolation and all the prerequisites that are necessary to see groupthink in action, and that is thought to have led to the Challenger disaster. Another common instance of groupthink that's often brought up is the invasion of the Bay of Pigs during the Cuban Revolution in the 1950s. Now, the plan at the time was people were really concerned about communism and Fidel Castro, and there was a plan to invade Cuba using a small elite task force. I'm just going to show you a short video of this in case you're not familiar with what happened.
But has established
At a secret base in the Guatemalan jungle, American CIA agents have been training Cuban exiles to invade Cuba.
Musgrave, who is a medical doctor and surgeon, is quite
This, they thought, would be the impetus for the Cuban people to rise up and overthrow Castro. The plan was presented to the new president, John F. Kennedy.
Kennedy felt that a plan that he had inherited, under which
At the
a
bottom of
band
the
of
ocean,
Cuban
investigators
exiles
found
were
that some of the
to
crew's
liberate
emergency
their own
oxygen
country
masks had been
was one
turned
he could
off.
hardly turn his
Then
back on.
another astronaut, Scobie, fought for any and every
Surely
Sorry
the
about
United States should help get rid of a communist dictatorship in our hemisphere.
The CIA badly misled the new president, promising him an easy victory and an end to the Cuban problem. Kennedy agreed to the invasion, but demanded crucial changes to hide America's involvement. Just 3 days before the planned invasion, Kennedy denied any possibility of American intervention.
There will not be, under any conditions, be an intervention in Cuba by United States Armed Forces. And this government will do everything it possibly can, and I think it can meet its responsibilities to make sure that there are no Americans involved in any actions inside Cuba.
As Kennedy spoke, the invasion force was gathering. An advance wave of American bombers planned to destroy Castro's air force on the ground. The president, worried that this might reveal Washington's role, ordered the operation scaled down. On April the 15th, 1961, just 6 American bombers, disguised in the colors of the Cuban Air Force, took off from Nicaragua for a crucial attack on Cuban airfields. But with so few bombers, only 3 Cuban planes were destroyed. 7 civilians were killed. As they buried those who had died, Castro, seeking Soviet support, finally declared that the revolution was socialist.
Continuamos preparando. Resistir nada.
We prepared ourselves to resist an invasion against all the forces we knew the Americans had at their disposal.
Estados Unidos.
The following day, just 1,500 exiles, equipped with American arms and ammunition, arrived at the Bay of Pigs, 125 miles to the south of Havana.
Éramos los hombres más felices del mundo.
We were the happiest men in the world because we had the opportunity to return to Cuba, our homeland, to fight to rescue freedom and democracy so that our country could be for all Cubans.
American planes were to protect the invasion force as they hit the beach. But Kennedy, now faced with international condemnation for the initial bombing, canceled the air support. Castro's remaining air force quickly destroyed the ships carrying vital ammunition supplies. Mistakenly believing that this was a full-scale American invasion, Cuba mobilized all its forces.
Los peores momentos eran los iniciales, cuando teníamos poca información.
The worst moments were at the beginning. We didn't have much information about the enemy. We didn't know if they were 1,000, 3,000, or 10,000. We didn't know what types of weapons they might have. We didn't know if this was a total invasion.
Si podía provocarse una invasión.
Without American air support or resupply, the invasion force was outnumbered and outgunned. Within 72 hours, the invaders were either captured or dead.
Yo no me di cuenta de que esta misión ya estaba resultando imposible.
I did not realize that the mission was impossible until the last day, almost at the end.
Porque teníamos un exceso de
We trusted in our allies. We never thought they would forsake us or abandon us. We didn't think that they could betray the commitment they had with us.
Jack Kennedy was devastated by the fiasco at the Bay of Pigs, and he said it was a fiasco. He was not accustomed to failure in politics or in life. And he was more distraught than I'd ever seen him. How could I have been so stupid, he said.
How could they have been so stupid? Well, I think, folks, we know the answer to an extent. Like, it's surprising, right? These were Harvard-educated advisors, the best and the brightest, and they gave the go-ahead. And they were defeated within 3 days. So what happened? It was groupthink, right? It was groupthink at its finest.
Too smart. They've always been enormously successful, and I couldn't fathom how they could be such failures. Well, that's the title of the book, The Brilliant Disaster, and it's ironic, of course, and it's oxymoronic, but the brilliant part is the men who did it. Yeah. They were the best and the brightest, and you know, a number of Rhodes Scholars, Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, had been a Rhodes Scholar. There were many Rhodes Scholars. There was McGeorge Bundy, who'd been the Dean of Arts and Sciences at Harvard at the age of 34. He was just, I think, 42 at the time. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, had been the president of Ford Motor Company at the age of 40. All of these guys were really smart and really successful and had never really failed at anything. And I do think you have to attribute part of what happened to the fact that when they got in a room together and they looked around at each other, they saw a lot of brilliant people who they respected, and then they in themselves, they saw people who did not fail, and they forgot about Murphy's Law. You know, things go wrong. Yeah. So I jokingly say it might have helped to have a few less brilliant people, regular people, you know, in presidential administrations. People like me, for instance, I'm available. People to point out that things don't always go the way you plan them, and that would have been a good thing for people to think about. And people who ask.
So that's groupthink, right? A bunch of smart people that all wanted to impress each other, who had a strong leader in JFK, who were isolated from other groups that didn't have a clear decision-making process, that were under the most stress you could possibly be under. What does it produce? It produces bad decisions. It's almost as if the situation matters, folks. So groupthink, it's not just something in the past. Symptoms include these illusions of invulnerability, belief in a quick, easy war, whether that's the invasion of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba or the more recent war in Iraq. Belief in the group's moral correctness, the belief that there's good guys and bad guys, and we are the good guys. And if we're good guys, we must make good decisions, because if we don't, what do? We have dissonance, right? And this is especially true when we have these stereotyped views of who we think of the bad guys as being. That there's us and them, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys. And what are bad guys? They're dumb, they're evil, they're not going to make smart decisions. And so we underestimate them and stereotype about them and lose track of the sight that they are likely just as capable as we are. Finally, there are the situational pressures within the group that we talked about earlier, this self-censorship by members, direct pressure on dissenters to shut up and go along with the crowd, and the desire to please. We want other people to think well of us. We want the leader to think well of us. And when you have this pressure, whereas we know from the work on conformity and social influence, most of us are going to give in and go along with the crowd, which creates an illusion of unanimity, that if we know there are dissenters there, we just don't ask them for their opinion. Like, we know that Dallas over there in the corner is going to say that it's a bad idea, so we're just not going to ask Dallas what she thinks. How do we avoid this? How do you keep from being a victim of groupthink? Well, we do know something about this. One is that the leader needs to remain impartial. The leader shouldn't be committed to a viewpoint such as the fact that hot dogs are definitely not sandwiches, or that the way to go is to launch a ground invasion of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, or that Iraq needs to go to war. The leader needs to remain impartial so that people are not pressured to give answers that they think the leader will want to hear. We need outside opinions. When we close ourselves up into a little echo chamber, we just start reinforcing our own beliefs. We don't get the outside feedback from other folks who aren't susceptible to the same social pressures and social influence. We need outside opinions, and getting outside opinions can introduce views that we either have not thought of or that folks within the group don't feel comfortable voicing. Likewise, we can create subgroups. Instead of putting everyone in this big pressure chamber together, we can break people up into groups of 3 or 4. We can get down to those smaller groups, because smaller groups make better decisions than big groups, remember? We saw that already with the murder mystery. So by breaking down groups, we not only reduce pressures of conformity, we not only make it easier for people to speak up, we actually improve the decision-making process itself. And finally, we can ask for people's opinions anonymously. This is why we have anonymous voting, because we know that when people know how you're going to vote, it changes what people say, right? That if people are experiencing a lot of social pressure to answer one way or make one decision, one way that people can feel safe and be less worried about pleasing others and more worried about making the right decision, getting it right instead of getting ahead, is by reducing the likelihood that they're going to receive negative flack for saying so. So how does this apply to juries? This is something that you may be thinking of in terms of one of the most common cases where we actually have groups making decision. You may have been on a jury. I haven't gotten jury duty yet, but I really want to, because I want to see how this works. But if you haven't seen it, one of the most classic movies here is 12 Angry Men. So there's a quick trailer for it in case you haven't seen this video before. It's a great movie if you haven't seen it. I definitely recommend it.
On the point of that knife, a man's life is at stake.
I'm just saying it's possible.
And I say it's not possible. I want you to watch this because I don't want to have to do it again. I'll make myself about 6 or 7 inches shorter, okay?
It's about right, maybe a little more.
Okay, a little more.
What's all?
Here's what I think happened. Not going to be positive about anything. I don't understand you people. I mean, all these picky little points you keep bringing up, they don't mean nothing.
You are going to try a man for murder. The awesome power to kill will suddenly be thrust into your hand.
Watch them and pray, for someday you may become one of them. 12 men with the smell of violent death in their nostrils.
What's the matter with you guys? You're letting them slip through our fingers.
Slip through our fingers. Are you his executioner?
You since you walked into this room, you've been acting like a self-appointed public avenger. You're a sadist.
12 men turned into 12 clawing animals.
So in 12 Angry Men, something that doesn't happen very often happens, which is that a bunch of folks who thought someone was guilty were persuaded over the course of the movie to vote not guilty instead. Now, this almost never actually happens. What actually happens, and you should resist this if you're ever on a jury, and you will be on a jury one day, most likely, which is that the initial majority often wins. Now, it cannot be the case that the initial majority is often right. This is a group process where people are using social norms about what people believe, these descriptive norms. Most people think this person's guilty, so I guess they're guilty, and then they go along with the crowd. That, I don't need to tell you, is not how we should be making decisions about who goes to jail. So for instance, if we have case A, 7 jurors vote not guilty, and then 5 jurors vote guilty for initially, and in case B, where 7 jurors initially think guilty and 5 jurors think not guilty, what are people most likely to end up voting? Well, which one do you think is more likely to be overturned? Do you think that the 5 jurors who think the person is guilty is more likely to persuade the majority that thinks they're not guilty? Or do you think that the 5 jurors who think the person's not guilty are more likely to persuade the 7 jurors who think they are guilty? So case B is more like the 12 Angry Men scenario. And it is also the less likely scenario that if the majority of folks start off thinking not guilty, a minority of people that do think that they're guilty can get them to change their mind. It almost never goes the other direction. Overcoming the majority is difficult, especially when the majority thinks that they're not guilty to begin with. So let's recap. Why is group decision-making not optimal? We don't share all of our information. Group members discuss shared information early on in discussions. So when we talk about murder mysteries, for instance, and trying to figure out who did what the information people tend to share up front is the information that all of us already know. Think about that again. The information we tend to share up front is the information already all of us know. In other words, the completely pointless information. If I already know it, I don't need you to tell me it. That's bonkers. It's obviously not about information sharing. It's about social bonds, and it's the safe, easy thing to do. It's how we make conversation, right? If you go up and you start small talk with someone, you start small talk about something that they already know. Like, oh, look at the weather today. You don't start off with novel information, but in decision making, that novel information is what we really need to know. But it gets worse. It's not just that we share the information that everybody already knows up front. We then just keep repeating that information over and over. Like, oh, did you see how sunny it is outside? Yes, I saw how sunny it is. Did you see how sunny it was today, Jack? Oh, I did see how sunny it was. This is the worst idea ever if we're going to benefit from the individual viewpoints that people bring to the table. It gets worse. Of course it gets worse. Here's the problem. It's not just that we tend to share the stuff that everybody already knows up front and repeat it more later. Status matters. Folks that are high in status do feel more comfortable sharing that kind of unshared information, the stuff that other people don't know, but the people who are low in status in the group don't. So think about this in the groupthink scenario. If you have a strong leader, the strong leader might be comfortable sharing both unshared and shared information, but all the rest of the people that aren't the leader are not going to feel like they can mention anything that's not already known. This is a complete use of people's time. I'm also privately convinced this is why meetings are so miserable, because it's just a bunch of people saying over and over the things that everybody already knows. So this is especially problematic because it means that the majority of folks, because the majority of folks are not going to be high status, are not going to mention the only information that's really worth sharing. And if they do mention it, people aren't going to remember it. So how do we make group discussions better? We have a few suggestions, and you should keep this in mind when we're moving to these group formats online when we're talking about online discussion forums. Don't just repeat what everyone knows. Talk about your unique experience. So one recommendation is that we should recognize that each other are competent and have expertise. When people know that we're experts in different things, we're more likely to share information. We're more likely to take them seriously when they say things. One way we can help foster this is having a strong leader who's not only impartial, but who recognizes each member's specialty and consciously seeks that out, who takes sort of charge for saying like, oh, like, Anne, why don't you tell me more about journalism? Or Brianna, what does people think about this in the literature department? When we recognize and solicit unique information from people, people are more willing to share it. So you can use that high status for good, but you have to be conscious about it. And finally, time. Most of us don't feel comfortable sharing unique information right up front. And so if you only have a 5-minute meeting, no one's going to share the information people need to know. So having a little bit of extra time for people to feel comfortable and safe sharing that information is really, really helpful. So I want to wrap up today by saying that groups can make good decisions. They're under the right circumstances, but they can also make incredibly, incredibly bad decisions. Even really smart people, even really brilliant teams of individuals in the wrong situations can be capable of catastrophic decision making that not only leads to poor outcomes, but literally costs people their lives. Situations are powerful. Thank you.